The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. I appreciate you inviting me here to Burlingame Lodge. I hate introductions, and so I'll have to find a way to properly repay you for the embellishment of that. I was just looking through the participant list. I'm so pleased to see so many great friends of mine on here. Last night I was talking to the Worshipful Master of the Northern California Research Lodge, Brother Kem Apak, who I see on here. And nothing like seeing Most Worship Brother John Cooper, your previous speaker, among the attendees tonight. Certainly no pressure there. Good to see so many friends tonight. Please, as Marty said, feel free to put things into the Q&A or into the chat, and I'll try to take a look at those periodically through this. But I do want to share with you about something I'm really passionate about, and it's new and renewed lodges. Freemasonry in the 21st century. And this is a topic that both is near and dear to my heart due to my work with the fraternity in building new lodges and working with member services, but also a lot to do with my work outside of this. I was a charter member of Prometheus Lodge. Roberto is also a master of 2 lodges outside of California, one in DC and one in Connecticut, and I helped found one in Connecticut too. So I've had this weird streak. And I don't know if you guys have this same problem that I do, but I frequently walk into buildings and I start figuring out if a lodge could meet there. It's a sickness, really. And so I hope that you don't have this same problem, but if you do, some of this might resonate with you. But what I really want to talk about today is less about how do you form a new lodge, but really what was Freemasonry like previous to today's Masonry? And as we are at this cusp of thinking about the 2050 vision for our fraternity and entering into the 2025 plan, it's a great time for us to ask the question of what do we want Freemasonry to be like today in the 21st century? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start moving into this. You know, Freemasonry is the world's oldest and greatest fraternity, and we can trace it through at least 4 centuries right now, where there is good documentation. Now, I'm hesitant to say more about that with John Cooper on the line, who probably could write a dissertation on Freemasonry in the 17th century. But John, don't judge me too much for only talking about these ages of Masonry. It's in these ages that I'd like to spend some time talking about what was Masonry like? What did lodges have in their possession? How many members were there? What was it like going to lodge? What did people talk about? And how did the organization function? And I want to examine it through each of these ages and then spend a little bit of time talking about what is Freemasonry like in California today. And then I think we'll end talking about what could it be like? What would we like it to be? And so I would love for you to be a part of that. In the 18th century, we really talk about Tavern Masonry. And so I show up here on the screen for those of you who are students of Masonic history, you'll probably recognize these 2 emblems. The first one is the Goose and Gridiron. That's the pub where the very first Grand Lodge was created in June of 1717 in London, England. And later, as Freemasonry moved across the pond and into Boston, Massachusetts, the very first lodge in North America was formed at the Bunch of Grapes pub. That became St. John's Lodge in Boston. Probably kind of a running theme there, Freemasons. We certainly enjoy our refreshment, don't we? So not a terribly big surprise that our lodges frequented taverns. But this had more to do than just with the refreshment afterwards. Frequently, they were public houses. They were places where you could have a meeting. They had private rooms where one could gather and draw out the lodge. You know, frequently we talk about trestle boards, but some of you might know James Tucker. He's a past master of Logos Lodge, number 861 here in San Francisco. And James originally was a member of Prometheus, and I was helping him memorize his entered apprentice degree proficiency. And when we were talking about it, he was going through the motions and couldn't really quite grasp the spatial orientation of things. So I started drawing it out for him. This launched James into a love affair with tracing boards. Did you know that when we met as Tavern Masonry, the entered apprentices and the fellowcrafts would draw the lodge on the floor? It's because we didn't have all of the paraphernalia that we think about today. And so it was constructed in the space and then mopped away at the end of the night. We heard about our meetings in newspapers. There was an allure to Freemasonry, and many of the influential people in society were members. And so here, this is Paul Revere, when he was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, sent this notice in 1795 in the newspaper, calling brethren to attend the Grand Lodge. Can you imagine looking at the San Francisco Chronicle and seeing the call to join us for the annual communication in San Francisco? So that's where we received our notices. That's how we learned about what was going on with our lodges. But the size of our lodges were small and personal. What do I mean by that? Well, somewhere around 30-ish people, and everyone knew one another. There was a deep interpersonal connection with one another. And what did they own? Well, I already told you they met in taverns and they drew the lodge literally on the floor with chalk, charcoal, and clay. And they would wash it away at the end of the night. So the things that they owned were really the minimal things. And when you think about what is a requirement to open a lodge, well, a Holy Bible, square, and compass really is the sheer basis. And that's what many lodges owned. They made do with other things to get by. The tenure in office was for as long as one could serve, as long as it was necessary for them to serve. Think about that, Worshipful Master. You could be serving now for 10 years, 15 years as Master of Burlingame Lodge. But what's interesting is, lodges then didn't meet the way that they meet today. They met quarterly, they met as necessary for their lodge. And what they talked about while they were there and what they did there is very different from today's Masonry. They talked about current events and philosophy and science and civics, less about things like I'm talking to you about, and more about what were the happenings of the world. Remember, these were the learned members of our society, the movers and the shakers, and they were gathering together and they were expanding their knowledge and their free thought. And that was one of the key things that drew together members of our fraternity. And notwithstanding the fact that I worked for the fraternity, the rules and the regulations were very short and they were simple. There were not books of the California Masonic Code. It was, very simple. What do you need to do? Here are the things. Okay. Anything that's not covered there, we rely on the good judgment of the master to figure out. So not only might he serve for 10 years, he might also be responsible for figuring out all that gray space in between. I see your Worship Master turning kind of pale when I mention that. And that was the era of Tavern Masonry. The next era is Town Center Masonry. You see, as Freemasonry moved across the country, it would carry, or as members moved across the country, they would carry Freemasonry with them. And so when a new town was created, or they wanted one to be created, it was frequently there that Masonic lodges were at the center of those communities. Now, this portrait is the lodge over Simpkins store, and some of you probably know this portrait well. But take a look at it really quick with me. You'll see on the bottom of the image, there is a store, a Simpkins store, hence the name of the portrait. But it was the general store in the middle of town. But on the top of it, you can see a lodge room. And if you were to peer into that lodge room, you would see, brothers standing around. We can see one kind of standing over here and another brother over here by the secretary's desk. We see that they were gathering together. How do we know it's a lodge room? Well, you can see the square and compass over the door. Now, some of you may have gone out to Columbia, California. Now, that's a state park these days. That incidentally was created when Earl Warren was governor of California. But here we see an example of a lodge up in Columbia. if you go into the museum there, you'll see a lantern, and that lantern has on one side a square and compass, and then if you were to turn it, you'd see the 3 links of chain emblematic of the Odd Fellows, and if you turned it again, you might see the emblem of the Woodmen of America or such. Fraternal societies were very important in many towns, and particularly here in California, but they didn't have their own buildings. They would come together and they would share that building. And especially here in California, many of those buildings were important civic buildings. They were not just lodge rooms, they were stores. Many of them were schools, or in the case of the oldest building here in the state of California in Benicia, it was even a place where the state assembly met for some time when Benicia was the capital of our state. These buildings were important, and they talk about the importance that our fraternity played and the members played in them. How did our members know that lodge meetings were happening? Well, they posted things in town on the building, and this was the kind of the meter of it. If you walk around some of these influential buildings, you'll see they're in the center of town. Take Petaluma Hamilton Lodge in Petaluma. The building is actually on the seal of the city of Petaluma. So important is that building that is actually the major icon of the city. And so you would just post on the building, this is what is happening at our lodge, and people would come and they would join. The sizes of our lodge were still small and personal at this time, still around 30 people. And actually, here's a side story. There is a fascinating book written by a woman by the name of Lynn Dumanil. And Lynn, she did her PhD at the University of California at Berkeley, and she studied the permanent records of Live Oak Lodge, number 61, over in Oakland. And for those of you who are secretaries in the room, first off, Secretary Power. Second off, the permanent records of a lodge that you keep, the minutes, the charter, the bylaws, the applications, and the Tyler's Register are important. And they're so important that people actually use them to do their doctoral theses, as Lynn did. And she studied what was it like from 1890 to 1930 in Oakland, California. And she used Freemasonry as her vehicle to understand that. She looked at the applications and understood the professions that people had. She looked at their last names and understood their ethnicity. But the one that I'm most fascinated by is she looked at the Tyler's Register. And she looked at the Tyler's Register both for stated meetings and special meetings. And she tried to understand how many Masons come to lodge. Well, you know, these were the days when we built giant buildings or were on the verge of it. But would you believe that the attendance at lodge was always between 15 and 50 with an average of 30? Sounds a lot like Freemasonry today. Well, so she studied these things. And in the era of town center masonry, we understood that these lodges were still very small and they were very personal. But because now we owned our own building, instead of dragging everything to that tavern with us, our possessions began to grow because we could store them in the building. This is the era when we started seeing the appendant bodies becoming very popular and influential. And part of that was there was a pageantry to it. The Royal Arch degree, the Scottish Rite degrees, the Order of the Temple, they all have beautiful props and pageantry, but we needed to have a place to store them. And this is the time when we started seeing them come into our fraternity in full vigor. Lodges still maintained their officers for as long as it was necessary for them to serve. The topics changed a little bit. We stopped talking about philosophy and science as much, but bearing in mind that the members were still the leaders in our community in these small towns, it doesn't surprise us to know that they talked about current events and civics. And all this time, the constitutions of our order were short and they were simple. Now, this brings us into the Masonry that you and I know. Freemasonry in the 20th century, which we call Cathedral Masonry. Now, the image on the left-hand side of your screen is of the Detroit Masonic Temple. It's the largest Masonic building in the world. And in there is a movie theater and a theater for plays, a bowling alley, a swimming pool, a barber shop, something like 30 lodge rooms. And there are even rooms for brethren to stay in, though most of them are not used these days. But it talked about the vision that we had for the fraternity. And over here on the right, this is the building in Sacramento, California on J Street. And if you take a look at it, I think that you'll see that it has even some of the same elements of design as that building in Detroit, Michigan. In fact, even this is a common style of design that we saw across the country. This is walking distance from the California State Capitol. And it's part of the era of Cathedral Masonry. There are, I believe, 4 lodge rooms in there, a ballroom, minor parlor rooms. It's an edifice. This is when we started shifting into the Freemasonry that you and I know today. This is the time when we set up schedules of meetings, the idea of fixed, stated, and special meetings. And this is when our lodges began to grow. They became the mega lodges. Part of that came around in the 1960s when we started seeing consolidations of lodges. But really, it was with a membership boom in the 1950s that began to fuel it. We saw lodges getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And because we decided to build these cathedrals, my did our possessions begin to grow. And you probably know that. Once upon a time, Marty took me on a little tour of the Scottish Rite offices in Burlingame, and we came across the old paraphernalia of Herman Lodge. Herman Lodge was the German-speaking lodge of the Grand Lodge of California that moved from San Francisco and ended its tenure in Burlingame. There probably are still in those lockers the aprons of Herman Lodge. And that's because we have places to store them. This is also the time when we started thinking about the progressive line, 1 man, 1 office, 1 year. And we started kind of churning through these. And if you go back and you take a look at those portraits, actually Burlingame is a great place to look at this because you see all the offices. You can start seeing when we started churning 1 man, 1 year, 1 office. We even stopped talking about civics and current events in lodges. We only talked about lodge business and events. And in fact, other topics were discouraged. Even a young John Cooper got admonished by his Grand Lodge for talking about Masonic research back in the day. Heaven forbid. And this is the era when the California Masonic Code came into existence. One of my predecessors as the Assistant Grand Secretary famously was against the California Masonic Code. Not because he thought it was a bad thing to have a system of rules, that there were bad rules in there, but because they shifted away the idea that the lodge should be governed by its master who has the ability to govern it, or as he put it, he said, the good judgment of the master would be removed. And that's interesting, isn't it? So here we can see a little bit about what was going on in our fraternity for the first 3 eras, the tavern, the town center, and the cathedral. And we'll end our time today talking about what does the 21st century look like for us. This is the powerful question that we get to hold on to as members of our fraternity. We're not just stewards of it, we're the leaders of it. We are the people for whom Freemasonry exists, and we get to choose who we are going to be today. I want to tell you a little bit about what the state of California and Freemasonry looks like today. You know, we just are finishing up the 2020 strategic plan. And one of the goals of the 2020 plan was to provide for strong lodges and halls. Now, some of you may know I'm a scientist by training. And what you may not know about scientists is we are lazy, lazy human beings. We do not like doing things that other people have already done. I want to take it, I want to learn from it, I want to improve on it, and I want to do the next thing. No need to reinvent the wheel. Well, that's the benefit of Freemasonry. We exist in every continent on the globe. There was even a lodge that occasionally meets in Antarctica. Freemasonry exists on every continent on the globe. And one of the benefits of our fraternity is we get to engage frequently with our colleagues. And so we get to look around the globe and understand, where are the strongest lodges in our world and what do they have in common? What does Burlingame Lodge, number 400, have in common with Mornington Lodge, 6322 in England? Well, I'll tell you. Wherever we looked, there were three key attributes of the strongest lodges. They tended to be a small lodge of close friends. And those close friends, they all attended the meetings. There was a high amount of attendance among them. And every one of those men felt that they had something that they were contributing to our fraternity. There was a high engagement in what they did. It wasn't just about coming and sitting on the sidelines. It was about doing. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Freemasonry is an organization who is dedicated to the idea of building. In our iconography are working tools of a builder. So it makes sense that we call to us men who want to make a difference in the world. It's not about that. So this is the exciting thing. Small groups of friends, high attendance, and high engagement in their lodge. I'll tell you, there was a really interesting study done by the US Department of Labor, and they told us that by 2025, 40% of Americans are going to be working from home. I don't think they anticipated, though, but by 2020, though, 100% of Americans were going to be working from home. Now, I make this joke, but the point of it is, though, when we're working in our offices, we get a lot out of our colleagues. And I still get a lot of them through these screens and meetings. I get to stop by and say hello. How are you doing? I get to go out and have coffee. When I'm having a great day, I can celebrate. And when I'm having a bad day, I can have a Manhattan with them. It's about creating deep personal connections. Our ritual tells us this too, right? Freemasonry is made for the social creature. Man is made a social creature. And so I think that as we are moving at a distance from one another, we are in a good place. Freemasonry, Rotary, Kiwanis, book clubs, churches, to help people be connected. And I'll tell you, it is absolutely true. We are seeing more people interested in Freemasonry right now than we do during normal times. And I think it's because we're crying out for interpersonal connection. We like being with people. But one of the things that we know is that the world is getting smaller at the same time, right? I have 2,000 some odd friends on my Facebook, but I could not tell you what they are doing with their lives. I can tell you what they ate last night for dinner. I can tell you what their kid or what their pet looks like, but I can't tell you anything about them. And I think that that's the thing that's so interesting for people coming to Freemasonry. They want a true connection. They want true friendship, not some superficial ideal. And that's one of the things that we really have the corner of the market on. We know how to have deep interpersonal relationships. I'll just tell you, the average Mason in California right now has been a member of our fraternity for 25 years. But this is the interesting piece. The average age of an applicant to our lodge. Now, what I did is I took all the applications in the past 5 years and the age of the applicant at the date that he submitted his application. the median age of that person was 36 years old. They were as young as 18, they were as old as 89. And what's interesting about that is if we were to take a look at them in generations. Now, some of you are probably ethnographic researchers here on the call. We may differ as to when you'd like to break up the generations, but they stand pretty true here. What's fascinating about this is there were as many baby boomers and Gen Xers combined as there were millennials who applied to our fraternity in the past 5 years. But yet, when we went and we talked to these people, any one of these 5 generations, and we said, what are you looking for? You might think that they're looking for different things, but I will tell you they are not. Every one of us who comes to Freemasonry is looking for true friendship, for a way to learn and improve ourselves, and for the ability to make a difference in the world. And that's fascinating. Now, I'll tell you, the size of a lodge is an interesting impact on this. I told you about the work of Lynn Duminal, and we took a look at the size of lodges in the tavern and town center eras. Well, this isn't new. This is the Regius Manuscript. It's an epic poem of 792 lines, theoretically written by King Athelstan in England. And it gives a charter to Freemasonry to operate. And it says in there, hold on for one moment, that a master shall take no apprentice unless he has good assurance to dwell 7 years with you, as I tell you, his craft and learn that he is profitable. Now, I'll tell you, I am blessed. I have a good friend of mine who is English, and he resides at the Masonic home in Union City, and he's on this call tonight, and that's Worship Brother Edgar Fenton. And I said, Edgar, can you help me and translate English into English? And he looked at me and he said, Jordan, don't be daft. And I posited that had to have been a compliment. I don't speak English, but he told me, Jordan, don't be daft. What you really need to read is Anderson's Constitutions. So Reverend James Anderson was one of the gentlemen who was at the Goose and Gridiron Pub, and he helped frame up the foundations of Freemasonry. And so in 1723, he wrote down what it was we as Freemasons stood for. You have to understand, there were other Masons already existing in the world. This was just a group coming together and trying to differentiate themselves. And so they needed to put a stake in the sand and say, this is who we are as Masons. And one of the things that he says in there that clarifies that statement from the Regius Manuscript is that a master should not take an apprentice unless he has sufficient employment for him. Sufficient employment. I love this idea because it says it takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy to make a Mason. And many of us have conferred the degrees of Masonry on someone, and we have never seen them again. And we're never getting those nights of our life back. Now, that doesn't mean that that person out there in the world is not making a difference, but he's not making a difference in our lodge right now. And so this is an interesting concept from Reverend Anderson. What he says is, we should not admit a man into our lodge unless there is a reason for him to be there. This is, for all of you who own businesses, a pretty common idea. You don't hire someone unless you've actually got a job for them. And that makes sense. Now, just a little while later in Anderson's Constitutions, he goes on to say, there's going to come a time when a certain number of brethren are going to need to separate themselves from the lodge in which they were made Masons if the lodge becomes too numerous. If the lodge becomes too numerous, what could that mean? Well, one of the fascinating things of that book from Lynn Duminal was the average size of a lodge between 15 and 50 with an average of 30. There is a magic number out there in the world of about 30 Masons attending a lodge. And part of that seems to suggest there is a finite amount of work in a lodge. And so what they would do is they would say, okay, well, for us to keep engaged in fraternity, we're going to start spreading it around. We're going to start bringing more men into our fraternity, and we're going to start making a difference. Now, look, I'll tell you, here in California, we have about 55,000 Masons, and we compare ourselves frequently to the United Grand Lodge of England. For better or worse, that's a poor comparison because there are 225,000 Masons in England. But I'll tell you a better comparison is the City of London. The City of London has about 55,000 Masons, and the state of California has about 55,000 Masons. Now, I will tell you, for those of you who are geographically challenged, those are very different sizes. States. But what's really interesting is in the City of London, there are about 1,500 lodges. Here in California, we have 335. Now, the average size of a lodge in London is 27 Masons, and the average size of a lodge here in California is 170. Now, one of the great perks of my job is I get to go and travel on behalf of our craft. And were this a non-COVID time, I would be with you in Burlingame. But given that it's not, here we are all at home. But one of the places I get to go is to the Conference of Grand Masters of North America. So all the Grand Masters travel together in February and they have a joint meeting. And they always do it in really sexy places, like Omaha in February. Do you know how cold it is in Omaha in February? Okay, so don't worry, your per capita is not getting poorly spent. But we get to go to these meetings of the Conference of Grand Masters of North America. And, you know, I'll tell you, Grand Masters, they are a proud set for good reason. They do a good job for leading our craft. But in that room, I'd ask them, how many members are there in your lodge? And they would puff up their chests and they would be proud to tell me 50, 500, 365, and they would shout these numbers out. And so I would hear everything from, say, 50 to 500, with an average of about 150. But then I'd ask them this question: how many show up? And the puffed chests would begin to slowly deflate, and a nervous chuckle would move across the room. And I would hear numbers between 15 and 50, with an average around about 30. And I've been to Burlingame Lodge, and I know that you get between 15 and 50 with an average of about 30. And this is interesting. You see, here in North America, the average size of a lodge across the entire continent is 120. And everywhere else in the world outside of North America, the average size of a lodge is 34. So that means that if about 30 Masons attend, which is true no matter where in the world I go, that means that here in North America, we're seeing about a quarter of our lodge. But anywhere else in the world, they're seeing about 90% of their lodge. And think about what a difference it would make if we were seeing about 90% of our lodge on a regular basis. That's a powerful way of really engaging with one another. It's a way for everyone to be involved. Now, I'll tell you, I live in San Francisco. I think it's a world-class city. People leave their heart in San Francisco, sometimes even on the street corner. It's really weird. But nonetheless, in 1940, there were 775,000 people living in California, and there were about 75 lodges, which means about one lodge for every 10,000 people. And by 2015, that number had changed a little bit. There were 850,000 people living in San Francisco. Notice that it's bounded on 3/4 by water, so not a whole lot of growth. But all of the lodges had really moved out to the suburbs. Herman Lodge, that I mentioned earlier, had moved from the city out to Burlingame. So essentially, we had one lodge for every 100,000 people. Well, I'm really proud to tell you that there in 2020, there are 12 lodges in San Francisco now. And we're getting close to that number of one lodge for every 50,000 people. I don't think we're ever going to get back down to one lodge for every 10,000. But I do think we can get to one lodge for every 50,000 people. And in fact, there is a brand new lodge about to be formed in Freemasons Hall called Seven Hills Lodge. And that will bring this number up to very lucky number 13. And I think that that's interesting. I think it's interesting because it provides more access for people to engage in our fraternity. it seems that I say this phrase a lot, and it always seems to be true, and gets truer and truer by the day. But I think the world needs Freemasonry. And I think it needs us now more than ever. Freemasonry teaches us to come together as people. And I think that the world could benefit from us coming together and being more civil with one another. Now, look, I just want to tell you a little about some of those new lodges that are happening in the world. Since we started the 2020 plan, we have formed 29 new lodges up and down the state of California. And a couple of interesting facts about them, about 86% of members there live within a 20-mile radius, and probably 60% of them live within a 5-mile radius. And what's interesting about that is you can go out in your community and see members of your lodge. That's powerful. There are many places across our state where people drive sometimes for a half hour, an hour or more to go to lodge. And that's wonderful. There are lodges that have deep connections to us, but many of these new lodges are really rooting themselves in their communities. You can read some of the other stats that are on there, but the last one is the one I'm interested in. You see, we were forming a new lodge in Southern California, in a place where Freemasonry had never existed. And we sent out a little survey, and we said, hey, really interested, are you interested in talking about forming a new lodge? But two, how engaged are you in Freemasonry? And there was a whole population that said, oh, I am super engaged in Freemasonry. Awesome. Awesome. And then just to validate this, I said, so how often do you go to lodge? Super engaged in Freemasonry. I never go to lodge. Okay. How often do you go to Eastern Star, Scottish Rite? Anything like? No, I don't go to any of those. So just making sure I'm understanding this right now. What you're telling me is you are super engaged in Freemasonry and you never go to lodge. Yes, that is absolutely right. You and I have a very different interpretation of what it means to be super engaged in Freemasonry, but that's okay. We went and we visited one of these guys, and he there in his office had up on his wall his Golden Veterans Certificate. And there was the suitable amount of dust on the frame that told me that he had not put it up on the wall before I got there, that it had been there for a while. And we talked to him about how important Freemasonry was to him, how he lived his life as a Mason. He had his ring on his hand very prominently and proudly. And he told us about how he tries to make a difference in the world. And I said, well, why don't you ever go to lodge anymore? He goes, it didn't feel like there was something meaningful for me to do. And I didn't feel like I was really fitting in. I didn't feel like I had any friends there. And so we started talking about forming new lodges, and we started talking about other lodges nearby. And I said, well, would you like to visit some lodges, talk about this? And he goes, yeah, I would. I will tell you, he is now an active Mason again. And that's what I think this is about. The average size of a lodge is 170 people here in California, and the average attendance is about 30. That means that there's 140 Masons in your lodge that we're not seeing. And that's okay. That's okay. But part of Freemasonry is coming together and being inspired to make the world a better place. And so as we get more Masons engaged in this, I think that we're going to see good things. And I'll tell you, I've thought about this, and there are 5 lessons I want to share with you that we've learned from new lodges that I think apply to existing lodges as well. The first thing a new lodge gets to do is they get to choose their charter members and its leaders. Now, this makes sense. They don't have any kind of predecessors tying them down. But what I think is the lesson for existing lodges is we need to choose our leaders for the moment that we are in. It's less about, it's your turn to be master now, Gary, and it's more about, what does the lodge need at this moment? We have a fear of retreading past masters. Well, if we were talking about a challenge that Marty Cussing was particularly good at, it might be time for Marty to be master again. If we were looking at things, we need to tap in. John Cooper is now the charter master of Columbia Historic Lodge under dispensation. The man has served as past Grand Master. Goodness, he came out of the womb wearing an apron. Freemason for life. we lean in and we seek leadership where we need it. So we don't just progress people up a line just because. We think about who are the leaders and what do we need. And so that's lesson one. Lesson two is choosing the right meeting place. Now, in Masons, we eat with our eyes first, and then we eat with our mouth second. If you've been to any Masonic event, you know that Masons eat. Uh, but how the building looks makes a difference. Now, there is a lodge that meets in downtown Los Angeles, conveniently called the Downtown Masonic Lodge. If they ever move, their name will make 0 sense. But they meet at the Los Angeles Athletic Club. There's no Masonic Lodge in downtown LA. And so they call themselves a lodge in a box. So they wheel in a box of Masonic paraphernalia, set up their lodge. At the end of the night, they put it away and wheel it away. Kind of the basics of Freemasonry get put together and then wheeled away. It reminds me a lot of Tavern Masonry. And it really causes us to think about what's the core of Freemasonry? And then also, what is our surrounding saying to prospects, to affiliates who are coming by our lodge? Are we putting our best foot forward? Are we eating with our eyes first? Lodge identity is a big deal. And we spend a lot of time talking about it using this tool. It's by a guy by the name of Simon Sinek. And Simon wrote a book called The Power of Why. And what it tells us is that every organization that you and I belong to knows what they do. Most of them know how they do it, but very, very few of them know why they do what they do. And he gives some examples in the book, but what I can tell you is the strongest lodges in California and around the world know why they do what they do. And the lodges that have the greatest challenges just do a lot of activities. They don't try to understand it. And I'll give you an example. I was talking to a master of a lodge in Nevada, and he was telling me how he was having some challenges, could not get members to come back to lodge. I said, well, what are you doing with your year? What does it look like? Well, we've got the summer picnic, and we've got the Father's Day brunch, and we've got the Widow's Xbox tournament. And I said, okay, what do any of these things have to do with one another? And thank you, Roberto, for at least laughing at my Widow's Xbox tournament joke. I appreciate that. I was afraid when Gary didn't even flinch that it had flown over everyone's heads. Point being, he wasn't trying to go to the core of his lodge. I spent some great time with the Masons out at YOLO Lodge talking about what is the important things that happen in the year for their lodge. And they talked about that. I said, plan for those things. Forget all the other things that your lodge has been doing for 3, 5, 10, 20 years that don't inspire you. Do the things that inspire you. Understand your identity. And that's a big deal. The fourth lesson is don't panic. This might sound entirely too Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but it's true. You're not alone out there. Many times I get phone calls from Masons going, oh my gosh, this thing has happened, and it has never happened to anybody else in the entire history of Freemasonry. The best one that happened to me last year was a secretary called me, and he said, oh my gosh, this has never happened to anybody else in the entire history of Freemasonry. We have elected a man to be master of our lodge. It is now Friday. Tomorrow is Saturday, and we are about to have the installation, and he has just informed us all that he is an atheist and no longer eligible to be a Mason. What do we do? Believe it or not, I had that same problem 2 years ago. The point of it is you have resources. You have people to lean into. You have your inspector and your assistant grand lecturer. You have all of the member services staff. And unfortunately, you guys also have Marty Kussing here who can help you out with any Zoom problem. But point being, there are resources. So when you are feeling stressed, and I guess this is particularly true in the COVID world, lean into your resources and don't panic. And the fifth one is a rising tide lifts all boats. I belong to Prometheus Lodge in San Francisco, where I am the master. And last year we moved into Freemasons Hall. There are 10 lodges that meet in Freemasons Hall. And at first blush, people are like, oh my gosh, how do you figure out who's candidates, what's going on? I will tell you, Freemasonry has never been better in San Francisco, or at least up on Nob Hill, than when we had Freemasons Hall, because we're all pulling together. And what benefits one lodge benefits all of us. And that's cool. That means that we all get the benefit of each other's strengths. And we don't have to be everything to everybody. I don't have to do the summer picnic because there's another lodge that does the summer picnic way better than I'm ever going to do it. And that's cool. Yea, though I won't lie, Alan Castley throws a really good summer picnic. He's got a pool up in Brandon. But that's a benefit of being a Promethean. All right, coming back to this, I want to talk a little bit about modern Masonry. So we have talked in our time together today about Tavern Masonry, when we gathered together small groups of men, notified in the newspaper, and only had small possessions, when men served for as long as was appropriate. We talked about town center masonry, where we carried masonry with us as we helped build our new nation. And with that, we saw the leaders and the movers and the shakers of these towns coming together. We saw our buildings making an impact on communities, with schools and civic buildings and town stores, and even serving with the capital of California at one point. These things make a difference. They were still small lodges where people were truly engaged with one another with true friendship. We saw Freemasonry change a little bit in the 20th century, where we got mega lodges, lots of possessions. We started doing stated and special meetings, and we stopped talking about the world outside and really focused in on lodge business, because who doesn't love the reading of the minutes? But now we get to ask this question about the 21st century. Who do we want to be? Well, I'll tell you, here's what I think the 21st century has for us. I think we're going to have still fixed but less frequent stated meetings. I think that we're going to be able to draw together and really get to the crux of brotherhood. Now, I don't mean that we're not going to see each other as often. I just think that the stated meeting where we handle business becomes less important, and the brotherhood and the degrees and the time together becomes more important in the 21st century. I think that we're going to see a shift back to small and personal lodges. Now, look, some of you belong to lodges that have 400, 500 people. But I'll tell you, you actually still belong to a small and personal lodge, because probably 15 to 50, with an average of 30 of them, show up. Our possessions are going to dictate the fact that we meet in untraditional places, and that our possessions are going to be required, but they're also going to be more personal. I will tell you, in California, there are Masonic lodges in about 49% of our towns and communities. In the other 51% of the towns and communities in California, Freemasonry is not there. There are many Masons in those communities. But what I'll tell you is, I believe that Masonry makes a difference in its communities. I think that Freemasonry makes its communities better. Now, I don't think that Freemasonry is for every person, but I do believe that the places where Freemasonry exists, the community benefits from it. And so I think that what this one is telling us is that there are going to be places where we've got to be creative in forming new lodges, where it may not already exist, like the Downtown Masonic Lodge, and that we're going to have to be untraditional in how we approach that. I think we already see this happening in the 21st century, but we are going to see men serving in office for as long as they need to. We're going to see people coming back into service for as long as they need to. And I think that we are going to start having more topics about current events and philosophy and science and civics. And I think that a talk like this is a move in that direction. I think that the talk on given last month by Most Worship Brother Cooper is an even better movement in that direction. But I think that we are going to begin to expand our minds more in our lodges, and that's going to be good. And so here's that whole graph again of what's going on in our lodges. But I think what you'll agree with me is the 20th century is the anomaly in that. I think that we are going to look more like our great grandfathers' masonry than we do like our fathers' masonry as we move into this new century. And I think that's all because of what makes Freemasonry relevant today. And these are the same things that we saw that make the strongest lodges in the world, and the things that we heard from all those generations of men who are joining our fraternity. We want to make true friends, not passing acquaintances, but people who we know that we can lean into. When we're having a good day, we can celebrate with, and when we're having a bad day, we can lament with. We want to learn and improve ourselves. And sometimes that's asking a guy like me to show up at your lodge. But really, more often than not, it's about surrounding yourself with good people, people who inspire you to be the greatest version of yourself. People like Cirilo Marquez, who's on tonight's call, who's our Grand Commander and Knights Templar in California, and Bill Bermudez. Guys like Barry Kopp, who inspire us to be the greatest version of ourselves that we can be. And finally, what makes Freemasonry relevant is our desire to make a difference in the world. And there's two differences that we make. There's the big difference, things that you and I could not do alone. Things like the Shriners Hospital, the Masonic Homes of California, our commitment to public education and childhood literacy. Things that you and I just don't have the pocketbooks to do all those on our own. Or if you do, you should talk to me. And I'm sure we could get a good philanthropic donation going. But really, it's about the individual difference, the one where when you show up, your time is well spent. We're a fraternity of builders. We are a fraternity of men who want to see the world be a better place than the one we came into. That's why Freemasonry is relevant. Now look, brethren, my name is Jordan Yelinek. I do have the greatest job. I am your assistant grand secretary, which means that I get to work for you every day, and I get to spend time with brothers up and down the state of California and around the world, learning how to make our fraternity better and hearing inspiring stories about how you're making a difference. And so, Worship Master, I want to thank you for inviting me to be with the men of Burlingame Lodge, and to all of you who are joining from elsewhere in the world. Thank you for letting me into your home for an hour or so this evening. And with that, Worship, I'm going to return the floor to you. And if there are questions, comments, concerns, doubts, fears, and or hesitations, I will instruct you to give those over to Marty, who will answer them in short order. Otherwise, I guess I could answer them too.
Actually, if those that have joined us late, you can see down at the bottom, you have a Q&A tab. You can go ahead and type your question in there. Gareth Stevens will field our Q&A this evening, and we'll leave about 10 minutes of Q&A, and we'll wrap it up from there. And those that we don't get to, we will forward on to Jordan. If you just want to write a shout out to Jordan, you can write it down there at the chat. I'll start this off for you guys. Jordan, I'm a relatively younger person. You and I are the same age. And I love your idea about smaller lodges where you have brothers and friends that have common interests. And often when I see people either on Facebook or at the gym or wherever I go, and I've got probably just like you a large friend base on Facebook that I probably don't know most of them, and they see that I'm practicing masonry, and they see me in person. They ask, "Well, Marty, what would I benefit from joining masonry, or what would it do for me, and what would your elevator talk in the 21st century be for a person in their 20s and maybe a millennial or somebody in their early 40s that are looking at masonry and seeing, well, I don't know if I really want to be in my father's or grandfather's masonry"?
Well, so a couple things to that, Marty. First off, one of the most interesting aspects of talking to different generations of men who've come to our fraternity is they all talk about it in the same vein. They're all looking for three things, and they say it in different ways, but it all really comes down to true friendship, learning and improving myself, and making a difference in the world. And so that's what I'd talk about with that person in the elevator or whatnot. It's about those three things. And you say, gosh, I don't know if they wanted to join their grandfather's Masonry. Man, the number of times I have talked to a prospect who tells me, well, gosh, my grandfather was a Mason and I didn't find out until his funeral, but these were the people who surrounded him and were supporting him in his life. I want to belong to the organization that my grandfather belonged to. So I know that the analogy you're trying to draw there, but it's just so funny. We hear people crying out for that grandfather's organization. Now I say people very intentionally. I'm not just talking about men. There are co-Masonic and feminine lodges in California, and they are growing in interest, and they're international organizations. And so there are more often than not women who will approach me who are interested in Freemasonry. And while they can't join our lodges and we can't go to theirs, there are exclusively feminine lodges and there are exclusively co-Masonic lodges also that we can't go to, even here in the Bay Area. So I think the greatest way to kind of advertise our fraternity is to be yourself. You know, the way that I really learned about Freemasonry was through Woody Woodward. Now, Woody was my Boy Scout troop committee chairman. And I didn't know what Freemasonry was, but he had the ring on. And when I joined my undergraduate fraternity, Kappa Alpha, in college, I came home and we were chatting. My dad had a barbecue or something where they showed up. And I was chatting with Woody. He was like, oh, well, did you know the founders of my fraternity were Masons? He goes, well, of course they were. And we started talking about that. It wasn't until 4 years later that I became a Freemason. And by that point in time, Woody Woodward had passed this mortal coil. But what I knew was nothing about what Freemasonry stood for. I knew, though, that the organization that had Woody Woodward as a member, the organization that inspired him to be the guy that inspired me as a young man in Boy Scouts, was the kind of organization that I wanted to belong to. And so the other part of that elevator pitch, Marty, is absolutely nothing about what I think that you need to say. I think it has everything to do with how you hold yourself in the world and the inspiring message that you give to other people as you move through the world. And we all do this. You know, I look at the names of the men on this call and I know that many of you inspire me. And so I think that that's your elevator pitch. And you invite them to come and see.
Okay, Jordan, the first question or after Marty's would be, in the interest of smaller lodges, closer friends, and high attendance, have you seen other states take this approach? And have you seen their successes? And how do you measure their success?
Sure, yeah. I'll tell you the place that has done this most prolifically is the United Grand Lodge of England. They started off, I want to say maybe 10 years ago, Gary, talking about, well, I'm really bouncing this laptop all around as I lean on this. Got a standing desk. Well, there you go. They started off with a thing called the university scheme. And the university scheme really didn't have a whole lot to do with the university affiliated lodges. There are many of them in the GLE system. Like Apollo University Lodge or the University of London Lodge. But this was more about, you know, trying to attract university educated men. And they started really focusing in on the member experience. And they started forming new lodges and really trying to say, you know, what is it really going to be a good member experience? So how do we measure their success? Well, one of the ways that we have looked at it is member retention. So, many of you probably recall there was a period of time where the Grand Lodge of California handed out awards for lodges for the number of degrees conferred. We stopped doing that some years ago because it was less about how many degrees can you confer in a year, and more about what kind of a difference are you making in those men's lives. Now, I can talk particularly about my experience with Prometheus Lodge in San Francisco. Every man that we have initiated in our lodge, I know where they are in the world. Either they're at our stated meeting, or they have moved outside of the state of California, but they are still members of our lodge, and they send regrets to every meeting. So how do we measure the success of some of these programs? Things like that. What is the retention of members into your program? If we just were forming new lodges around and they weren't getting members who are retaining or something like that, that wouldn't be a good use of anyone's time. I think that what we're really looking for is how can we help spread the light of Freemasonry around the world? Because like I said, I don't think that Freemasonry is for everybody, but I do think that the communities in which Freemasonry exists benefit. And I also think that the men that become members of our craft benefit from it as well.
Cool. Okay, the next question is, what impact, if any, does member affiliation have on Mother Lodge engagement, growth, and sustainability?
Good question. So one of the things that people frequently ask when forming new lodges, gosh, are you just pulling all these guys away from their mother lodges? Well, a couple things to dissect that apart really quick. Let's remember that the average size of a lodge in California is 170 members, and the average attendance is 30. So that means that there's 140 members on average who are not attending your lodge. Now, some of you might ask, well, gosh, how many of them may have moved outside of the state of California or whatnot? Well, 85% of California Masons still live in California. And the average distance of a Mason from his lodge is 7 miles. So what that tells us is those 140 people aren't showing up for a reason. And that goes back to that story of the Mason that I went and I visited, and he had the 50-year award up on the wall. He wasn't finding what he was needing from his lodge. So when he went and helped form this new lodge or went and got active in another lodge, what he was doing is really helping to spread Freemasonry. Now, was he an active member of his mother lodge? No. Am I an active member of my mother lodge? No, it's in Washington, D.C., and the commute there this time of day is just hell. So what we have seen is there hasn't been a detrimental effect on lodges. There was a concern, oh my gosh, a member of a new lodge is, they're going to steal the senior deacon away from my lodge and my lodge won't be able to operate. I have not seen that happen. I have seen actually the opposite happen. I will tell you, there was a lodge that we were forming down in Southern California. I was concerned. It was forming near a lodge that was struggling. And I was not positive that they were both going to survive. The absolute opposite thing happened, Gary. Both lodges are thriving right now. And that goes back to that fifth lesson from new lodges. And that it's a rising tide lifts all boats. If something good is going on over in this lodge, it doesn't mean that something bad is happening over here. There's not a limited amount of good that can happen in Freemasonry. It's like there's not a limited amount of love in the world. Something good is happening here. Well, that tide's rising and I'm going to go up with it. And that's positive.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Next
Jordan.
question.
Jordan, I have a question to piggyback to that one. But in the same vein of thought, members that join other Masonic bodies, Scottish Rite, York Rite, they become involved at Shrine. They have no time now for their Blue Lodge. They try to divide up their time. It's not sufficient. Are we just spreading ourselves out too thin?
Well, if you take a look at Worship Brother Andrew Hammer's book, Observing the Craft, he would agree with that assessment. I'm not sure I would, though. I think that people find passions in different parts of our fraternity. I think about a good friend, Nick Races, who is a member of California Lodge #1. His real passion in Freemasonry was Knights Templar. He served for many years as the adjutant for kind of the Bay Area. And that's the guy who does ritual and kind of runs the administration of it, sort of like an AGL. And he did it exceptionally well. His passion was there. He served as master of his lodge, and he did a good job at it. So I don't think that, it's so much around limiting experiences. Now, you're right. There is only so much time in the day. And there are certainly Masons who are collecting cards for their wallet or lapel pins for their lapels. And, great. If that brings you joy in the world, that's going to work out. I think, again, Roberto, I'm a biologist. I think of all these things in terms of, ecology and systems. And one of the things I think about is things work as well as they do for as long as people have interest in it, right? And so long as someone is willing to put the time, the effort, and the energy into it, I think that we're going to see it persist. The obverse side of that is organizations have life cycles. I've been talking about the new side of it. The other side of that is organizations die, and that's okay. There's a whole Masonic organization called the Grand College of Rites, which collects rituals from defunct Masonic organizations, and they publish books of them every year. So just, think about it. Books of Masonic rituals from defunct Masonic organizations are published every year. That means that there have been a lot of Masonic organizations that have come and gone this way before us. Now, if I were to die tomorrow, no one says, that Jordan, he was a real son of a gun. He died and therefore must have been a bad person because only bad people die. No one says that. Now, look, you might say, congratulations, glad Jordan's gone, but that's for a completely other reason. It has nothing to do with the fact I was a bad person because I died. I could be a bad person for a whole other reasons. I'm friends with Marty. Things like that. Same thing with Masonic organizations. If it closes, surrenders its charter, consolidates, we frequently talk about it as if it's a bad thing. It's not. It's not. They have life cycles. They have life cycles and they move on. But I think, just to go back to your point, do I think that the appendant bodies, the concordant bodies, Shrine, Scottish Rite, York Rite, what if someone gets too active there and they don't have time for their lodge? The purpose of Freemasonry is to make you a better person. And if they are finding the avenue by which that they are inspired to be the best version of themselves they can be, I celebrate that.
Thank you.
Next question. What would you think about changing all our stated meetings into online Zoom type meetings and reserving our tiled meetings for degrees and festive boards?
That sounds like a John Cooper question to me. John, I'll tell you, what I think about that is I think that we are really benefiting from this pandemic. And I don't mean in the terms of the virus, but I do think we are being forced to re-examine the way in which we engage with Freemasonry. I certainly am attending a lot more Masonic organizations than I could have ever done in a prior world. And when we hosted our online annual communication, there were a number of things. And I'll tell you, I had a debrief session with the entire team who puts that on. There's about 20 people who work in the Grand Lodge office who plan all year and putting the annual communication, and hundreds of people who help make it happen. Marty, what did you just send a photo of? And I will tell you, it was a really good annual communication. And we did our debrief today and asked ourselves, what are the things that we learned from hosting a virtual annual communication that we would like to carry forward even into an in-person annual communication? And you may or may not know this, but there is a script for the annual communication. And next year, when you attend in person, because Lord willing, it's going to be in person, look at the Grand Master's podium and you will see that he's actually reading from a script. The whole thing is written out. And this year, the Grand Secretary and I really worked on it. And we made a much more efficient script because we needed to host a virtual one. And there were things that we did in it that I think we will carry forward. And it's a small piece. Another thing that we learned was with our spouses and partners program. For the very first time, we offered that online as well. And we had 300 spouses and partners from across California and some even from outside of our jurisdiction join us for it. That's the largest that we have had for that event. And incidentally, Marty helped run the back end of that one and got much adulation from our staff. And so I call that out here just for all of you to know. The entirety of the Grand Lodge of California is in Marty's debt for his assistance with that. And so you're very lucky to have him in Burlingame 400. But John, I think that there are things that we should be considering as to how do we handle the business of our lodges in an efficient manner and really focus in on the important things, the interpersonal relations, the conferral of our degrees, the festive boards, the things that people come out for certainly no one other than Ricky Lawler comes out to listen to the minutes of a stated meeting. Sorry, Ricky, I just saw you in the chat panel, had to pick on you. So yeah, John, I think that there is something to that. Whether or not they become Zoom-like stated meetings to handle the business or something else, I think that we need to consider how do we make the business of the fraternity easy and transactional. You know, certainly in England, they have what they call the Board of General Purposes. And that Board of General Purposes handles, you know, the minutes and the bills and so forth. And that way, when they come to their stated meeting, it's meaningful. It's not about debate and committee reports. And so I think there's something to that, John. I do.
Okay, question. It will be a great service that California Masons can meet and communicate online. This will enable brethren with similar values to create lodges. Does our Grand Lodge have any plans or desire to create a system like this?
That's a great idea, and that one is coming from my worshipful master, Kem Apak of the Northern California Research Lodge. Thanks for being here tonight, Kem. You know, many times these things are best fulfilled by local lodges. You know, iMember 2.0 is providing us an amazing platform for interconnectivity with people. And we're constantly looking for ways to expand that social feed and to enable us to connect with other people. But the best innovation that we see coming out of our craft isn't from the Grand Lodge coming telling you, thou shalt go do this thing. It really comes from local lodges saying, we'd like to do something. Do you know the original Lodge app that unfortunately got sunsetted earlier this year from a company called Group Ahead was actually found by the brethren of Phoenix Lodge, number 144. And they brought it to the Grand Lodge's attention, saying, hey, look at this great thing that we're doing. And we said, yeah, that is really great. We should give that to everybody else too. And so we helped spread that around. So, Kem, I would say to you, lead. Find the thing that helps connect people. We're certainly talking about new lodges being a vehicle for that. But I think that much to the point of John Cooper's question earlier, we are in a brave new world where we get to really unshackle ourselves from what Cathedral Masonry looked like for most of our lives and say, gosh, how can we really connect together? And I will just kind of piggyback on that one really quick. I think that when we start coming back to lodges and we start meeting in person, it's going to be a difficult road at some level. And we're going to need to lean into one another. And I think that's going to mean that we need people like you, like Patrick Muldoon, to show up and help bring people back. And so however we begin to reconnect, let's find a way to do that.
And I believe one more question, Brother Jordan. Gary, you have that one?
Well, there's several more questions. Should we just take one?
Yeah, why don't you, I see Brother Jones has an interesting question.
Okay.
Refreshments.
Okay. Given our roots in Tavern Masonry, what is the current Grand Master stance on having refreshments, in double quotes, in the lodge?
Well, as I saw above that one from Sebastian Tavot, who asks about the wages of fellowcraft as Sancerre, corn and oil, I certainly celebrate that. You know, what we know is lodges cannot purchase alcohol or keep it in their presence, but there are ceremonies for a table lodge that are already provided. But I think it's less about what are we doing inside of the lodge room, you know, and what are we doing together in the celebration. You know, one of the things that I'm fascinated about is the rites of celebration. In our lives, we come together and we celebrate graduations, we celebrate birthdays, we celebrate anniversaries, and we even celebrate funerals in the memorial of someone's life, because they all mark transition points. They all mark the point in someone's life when they go from old to new. They have become something different. I think Freemasonry is one of those things as well. I believe that the rituals of Freemasonry transform us. You are not the same person you were before you took the Undered Apprentice degree that you were when you were after. And you are most certainly not the same person after your Master Mason degree than you were before. We should celebrate those things. And so it's less about refreshments in the lodge and more about how do we celebrate after. Now, there is no prohibition on refreshments after, you know, so long as the lodge isn't buying any of those refreshments. But my encouragement to you, Brother Jones, is think about how your lodge can celebrate the transition points in a candidate's life, in the lodge's life, in the lodge's life cycle, and really bring people together for that.
Got it?
Yep. I think
Yeah.
we'll just pass if there's any other questions, we'll just pass them on to Brother Jordan. I think it's been a long night. He looks strong, but a little weary. Yeah, there we go. Thank you so much, Worshipful. That was a great and very entertaining, enlightening presentation. I personally enjoyed it immensely. Thank you for, again, being here tonight, providing us with another fantastic presentation. It's always a pleasure listening to you, brother.
Well,
Thank you so much. I would like to also give special thanks for all the support to our team in the back end. I think everybody knows by now, Worshipful Brother Marty Kusing, who is a magician with the virtual tech, and of course makes this presentation and all the Grand Lodge presentations run very smoothly. Thank you again for everything you're doing for us as a lodge and for Grand Lodge in general. Assisting tonight is also Worshipful Brother Gary Stevens. Thank you, gentlemen. Job well done. Brethren, thank you for being here with us tonight. Special thanks to all the lodges represented here. We have many lodges from Grand Lodge California, of course, but also we have representation from Grand Lodge of Japan, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines with us tonight. Gentlemen, we look forward to having you join us in the near future for our future speakers. Our next guest speaker is Worshipful Brother Douglas Russell. He will be presenting the Esoteric Art of Memory. That will be that's scheduled for December 8th at 7 p.m. That's the second Tuesday of the month. A flyer with instructions also will be to register will be forthcoming for that. Brother Chaplain, if you could lead us in prayer, please.
Yeah, actually, before that, I just want to let everybody know that are still on here. Those that have registered and those that weren't able to make it on, I will be sending this recording or uploading this recording to YouTube, and I will send out that link to all those that had registered. I also post that onto Facebook. So some of you have asked me if we can get a recording of it, and you are welcome to share that with whomever you'd like. Jordan, again, thank you. Jordan is the one responsible for me knowing how to do any of this technical things. I am not a biologist background. I am a clinical gerontologist, and now I do real estate. So this was all a learning process. And there was one other question on here I just want to really quickly answer since Vince is still on here. He asked how to support smaller lodges. And that is right up Jordan's alley. If you ever want to contact him or his colleague, worshipful brother Mike Ramos, they are the ones responsible for all of these new lodges that are being formed with smaller sizes in mind. So send Jordan or Mike Ramos a message or give him a call. They love to talk to you more about that. With that, if you can all join me in an attitude of prayer. Great architect of the universe, as we depart here this evening and take from our speaker, worshipful brother Jordan, all of these lessons that we've learned here tonight and what we've learned in the past several months in this time of COVID, and take it to heart and spread good masonry and good brotherly love around to our neighbors. May we so emulate your grace and your kindness. May every brother and family member be safe and in your love. Amen.
So mote it be. So brethren, stay well, stay safe, and have a great evening. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.